Everyone hear me and see me?
We hear you, but we just see your photo.
Okay. Okay, I'll turn my Zoom on, but I'm also on the CTN feed. Okay. So here I am as well. All right. Well, welcome, and we'll convene this meeting today of the Post-Secondary Education Financing Working Group, January 11th, 2022. I'm Representative Jason Doucette, one of the co-chairs of this working group, and I will pass it off to my co-chair, Jeanette Weldon.
Thank you, Representative Doucette, and looking forward to the meeting this afternoon. I think some of the members have presented some interesting information and ideas that we can use to make our final two meetings very productive.
Agreed. Thank you, Jeanette. Yes. So as Jeanette mentioned, this is our third of what we are assuming would be 4 meetings of this working group. We got a little bit of a late start by the legislation that enabled this and created this working group. We were supposed to have completed, I believe, by the end of the year, but we're a little behind schedule. We will go into next year to prepare a final report and see, of course, from there where things go. There may be some recommendations that I think this group may make, which may sort of bleed into the legislative session and hopefully be an opportunity for those who are involved in this working group to continue their involvement as the legislative session starts, particularly if there are recommendations which blossom into actual legislation. So I wanted to start today by sharing a few things that were brought forth by working group members. Item 3 on our agenda for today says present data provided by members. I think that's a holdover from the last meeting. Unless there's anything new that anyone wants to provide, but we can kind of do that at the end. I wanted to start with Julie Savino from Sacred Heart, who shared with us, I believe it's called the TCAS, Institute for College Access and Success Annual Report on Student Debt in the Class of 2020. I'll let her sort of give a high-level overview of that report. I think there's a lot of tremendously important and relevant information in this report that I think is worth us digging into and thinking about some more. So, Julie, I'm going to ask you to dive into this. Oh, Julie, you're muted.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Representative Doucette, for allowing me to be able to bring this forward to the group. And if you would allow me to share my screen so I can provide some information here that I think can help us narrow into the understanding of this report. I am going to okay, do we have here the PowerPoint presentation? Is everybody able to see this PowerPoint presentation? Does it seem to be okay? All right, thanks, Jeanette.
Yes,
okay. As was mentioned, this report is the 16th annual report, which was published this past November 2021 by the Institute of College Access and Support. It actually depicts student debt in the class of 2020. And I think that what you'll see is, as you said, I'm going to just give a very high level overview of what this report has. Within the report, you'll find that there are several areas that they discuss. It's very comprehensive. There's overview and findings on student debt nationwide, the trends that we're seeing, and as of this particular time, we're also starting to see the impact of COVID-19 is having on student debt and repayment of student loans right at the moment. There's student debt by state. There's a breakdown, and there's quite a bit of detail understanding all of our states across the nation. There's student debt by school type. There's a breakdown of whether it's public institutions, how the private nonprofit exist, and for a very brief presentation on the for-profit institutions, although this report is only really primarily for the public and private institutions. There's also some very good information on non-federal student debt. It's one of the few reports that actually pulls it all together from a number of places. Non-federal debt obviously is not something that the government is collecting, and it's reported separately by institutions across the country through various surveys and information pieces that we submit throughout the year. So a lot of it is self-reported data, but it's excellent data and it's quite comprehensive. There's data on debt for students at graduation, and throughout the report, based on much of the information, there's some policy recommendations. There's federal policy recommendations, there's recommendations for states, and there's recommendations for institutions. I've actually gone through the report. It's a lengthy report, has a lot of detail, and I have done some redlining of this report, and we'll make that red line available to the working group afterward so that we can discuss it today on a high level, but then you can focus in on some of the other items that you might find are interesting and perhaps maybe to help in writing the final report. The TCAS report summary is as follows. As you can see, Connecticut ranks pretty high up there as far as average debt is concerned. It's number 5 in the country. And where private debt is concerned, we rank number 3. But however, Connecticut ranks 21st for the percent of graduates who have debt. We're 8th for the percentage of students who have non-private debt. There's high debt remains concentrated in the Northeast. I think that's kind of a given. You'll see that the number of institutions that are up there are from the Northeast, but the ones from the low debt states are in the West. I mean, it's obvious Connecticut is a high cost state. It's not surprising that why we are up where we are. High cost to everything here to do business. I mean, for us to know for energy, salaries, benefits, etc. And certainly that equates to higher education. So it's no surprise that we have there. Borrowing rates have remained relatively flat over the last 10 years. And it's been a concern that the private student loan market has grown rapidly. Here, our debt levels in Connecticut might seem to be high, but they're in the middle ground when you start looking for those who have graduated. So while it may appear to be high in some ways based on where we sit, there is other ways where it seems very, very reasonable. And then based on the number of students that borrow. To have the whole discussion on debt and the choices that people make as to why they might choose student loans from a private perspective versus the federal perspective and others is oftentimes becomes a very personal matter for families. Sometimes it's very good financing, sometimes it's out of desperation. And so it's important to note that while we talk about student loan debts, we have to understand the default rates that remain a concern nationally, but default rates at public and private and nonprofit colleges in Connecticut remain relatively low. And we've already seen this with some of the reports already presented by the working group. And of course, right now, we don't understand what, COVID-19 has impacted a lot of our low-income students. and student borrowers, their families still, their concerns regarding higher education, for both repayment of loans and requiring the debt, and even deciding on enrollment is still kind of up in the air. And we will only see some of the impacts of those as these days unfold. We're approaching January 22nd, which is going to be the date in which or January 2022, which looks to me like, that's supposedly the date that student loans are going to start back into repayment again. So we've seen some things that are different by COVID, but the days going forward certainly will be different. This is the average debt of our graduates by loan by state in 2020. You can see that Connecticut ranks up there. It's number 5. New Hampshire's leading. They're leading. Connecticut is at $35,853. And you've got Delaware, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Connecticut. You've got your New Jersey, Vermont, Massachusetts, all within the top 10 for graduates with loans in the state. There's a percentage of graduates with debt by state also as well. Connecticut's kind of like in the middle of the pack. So 57% is, seems reasonable considering the type of institutions that we have here, both public and private, regarding their cost of education. I mean, the report goes on to actually identify lots of other things. Here's our average private loan totals for graduates with debt by state. And you'll see Connecticut's number 3. We've got District of Columbia, which is number 1, but we also have Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania amongst the top 10 within the country for totals for private loan spending. So while you can notice later on in the presentation and the delivery to you of the redlined report, you'll find that the TICA's state policy recommendations are supported throughout the report. And one of the biggest ones that for states is that they allocate available state grant aid based on need, not merit. They're realizing that oftentimes the states that are offering the least amount of need-based aid oftentimes have the highest amount of student loan debt as well, because it's a resource. Without those need-based grants are not then made readily available to students, it will oftentimes increase the amount of loans that students feel they need to take. They believe that exempt forgiveness amounts for federal student loans from state income tax is an important part. I think we all agree, that those could be some good things that we're doing, that we're able to have some accountability standards for schools that receive state grant aid. I think that in the state of Connecticut, we've done some wonderful things already with our students. We already have things in place where all of the colleges and universities within the state not only have their net price calculators there, we use the college scorecards, we're all using the standards for providing award letters and very good information. We have a good amount of support from CHESLA with some of the information that they're providing regarding understanding of financial wellness and other things, but certainly there's always more work to be done on that level. We can develop more within our own data systems for us to perhaps maybe understand. I mean, they seem to think that these are things that are important for all states and for the government as well to develop those. The promotion of more income-driven repayment plans, and along with things like with the federal government, the various different payment plans for public service and otherwise are being brought to the forefront and trying to get those to the students. There's also a discussion in the report about income share agreements, which is becoming more popular. And there are some, not a lot, but it has also been something that's been discussed as an option that perhaps maybe the state may want to look into. And then again, require colleges within the state to adopt different strategies to help reduce the burden. So these are all good recommendations, all things that we can continue to discuss as we look forward to the trends. Here's a few things I think in the state that I think are important for us as we move forward to understanding, while we can agree that some of those recommendations may hold very true for Connecticut as well as it will hold for all states. But this is how we're looking at our need-based need merit versus our need-based aid in the state of Connecticut. What you'll see here is that there's been some significant cuts of financial aid by the Malloy administration. And actually through the year 2009, 2010, and others, you can see that there's been some deep declines. Prior to in FY13, programs were actually merged into the Governor's Scholarship Program, which is now known as the Roberta Willis. But prior to that, there were 3 separate programs. There was one for private, there was one for the public colleges and universities, and then there was a small need merit program that was called our Capital State Scholarship that was actually portable to others. So you can see that while some of the programs were then merged into one, there's been a pretty deep decline in the amount of total state funding available for aid to our Connecticut students for this one here. This is the Connecticut expenditures as a percentage of our state fiscal report. It's from our National Association of Student Grant Aid Programs. This information here shows that there are 43 other states that spend a greater percentage of state funding for higher education on student aid than Connecticut does. We'll see that here's our national average. Right here is this orange column. It's about 13.41. And Connecticut sits down below here at 2.99 regarding the amount of expenditures that as a state we're offering to students. Estimated state grant dollars, again, for per undergraduate enrollment by state. This is just another way of looking at it. It's just a different metric. Connecticut's investment in student financial aid, it significantly lags, again, behind the national average. Maybe not as difficult as you might have seen in the prior chart, but here our national average is 688, and here in Connecticut, we're at 253. This next chart actually, again, explains the percentage of change in our state aid in the Northeast from 2008 to 2019. And you'll find that unfortunately, Connecticut has had the deepest decline of all of the states within our region, where we've declined 57.5% during that period of time versus others. So again, I think, in some part, while most of the Northeast colleges and universities still hold a fair amount of the debt because of the type of institutions that we do have here in the state, because the concentration of the number of students and the high costs, we're always going to be up there. But it's obvious that when there's resources available or not available to students, they will rely on debt, which is for a good portion something that you may find is relatively significant for us here in the state of Connecticut. Again, another way to look at our percent of state higher education funding allocated to need-based aid. Connecticut's only at 3% versus a number of the others. So our investment in need-based aid is still among the lowest in the region and of the nation. Again, and we've talked a little bit about the free tuition. Free tuition programs in this particular survey and all other financial assistance would not necessarily be, it's not going to be considered, it would not be reported as need-based aid based on the free tuition. This is a little bit different way, again, to look at our federal student loans. This is from the National Center of Education Statistics. this information was taken out. So if you look at from 2010 through 2019, you'll see that our public Connecticut institutions, we've reached up, we've hit some periods where our students have had to rely more heavily on loans. They align with whether it's been some of the financial crises that we've had where students needed additional resources to attend institutions, and you'll start to see. So the line is a little bit more erratic at our public institutions in the state of Connecticut, but still is actually above in millions of dollars what's actually at our the CCIC or the private institutions, the private nonprofits in the state of Connecticut, where our line is fairly flat and has grown again proportionately since this period of time through 2019. Student borrowing, again, is compared to institutional aid. Now, this is looking at the private institution sector. Oftentimes, with where student loan borrowing, the issue has always been, while it'll vary by institution type, one of the big differences is, as you see you'll see actually even in the report, depending on the type of institutions they are, how much financial aid they're providing to their students will make various differences in the evaluation and how the student debt reacts to how the financial assistance is awarded to student and the resource there. Here you can see from 2008 through 2009, there's been a 76.4% increase in institutional grant assistance that'll primarily come out of the institution's endowments. It will come out of tuition and fee revenues, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how the institutions are supporting. And again, we've held a pretty steady line regarding student borrowing in terms of dollars from 2008 to 2009, but you can see where the increases or the differences are between what the institutions are doing here. You're seeing a flat line as far as borrowing is concerned. Okay, so that was the last of my presentation, and I can stop my share now or go back to this chart, depending on if there's any questions or concerns right now, or discussion about what we might be on this particular report.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. This is great information, very relevant. The takeaways for me, obviously, Connecticut being towards the top of the list there in terms of average overall debt. Number 5,
Yes.
number 3 in private debt, which again speaks to the problem that is identified, which is over-reliance on borrowing and the price and the burden of borrowing on our student loan borrowers. I think too, this report actually identifies, we may have touched on it, but the fact that that the increase borrowing, and particularly private borrowing, disproportionately affects it alludes to college unaffordability for undocumented students and DACA recipients, but also
Correct.
talks about lower income students, BIPOC students, and students from low income background who struggle to repay private debt. So again, that with the burden being as it is in the state of Connecticut, I think speaks to what we're talking about here. In terms of the recommendations, we talk about promoting awareness of income-driven repayment plans. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that later. I think that is something personally that I'm very interested in exploring further as a potential solution to this problem. But finally, I think the biggest takeaway is one that you've illustrated quite well, which is that we could be doing better in terms of need-based and merit-based aid. I think we spoke about this at our last meeting a little bit. I mentioned the free tuition program. I understand now that when we talk about the way that aid itself is measured in these reports and in this industry, that we're not including programs like that. So while we're definitely proud of that program, and I think it will help overall, it's still in the way that we measure traditional grant-based aid is not going to be reflected here. So as you've identified, Connecticut ranks very low on that and has trended lower over the last decade. So that's a cause for concern and something that I think is definitely worth highlighting for this group. Let's see here, any
Mr. Chair.
questions or comments? You can raise your hand or just chime in.
Mr. Chair.
Who is that?
Bruce Adams.
Bruce, take it away, Bruce.
This is good information, and thanks for sharing. A question that popped up in my mind was whether or not we have the data to show the variability, really the increase in the price of an education over this amount of time. And can we, obviously there are borrowers who borrow in every state who go to schools in other states, so it's not a one-to-one comparison. But regionally speaking, we know that students tend to concentrate in their, roughly in their region where they attend school. So it might be helpful to take a regional, look and overlay the price, the average price of tuition over the debt loads, et cetera, so that we can make sure that, it's just not a straight line up to heaven for no reason. Because there's a very curious interplay between the availability of student loan credit and the price of tuition.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Julie, you have any thoughts on that? I noticed the same thing when we were looking at one of the last charts there that showed.
Well, I think that when you look at everybody in the Northeast, I think we're all facing the same things in the Northeast, whether we're a public institution or private institutions. And I made those comments regarding, the costs. We're just in a high cost region. I mean, and I think that it's obvious that's why it falls right now in the Northeast. So what can we do? I think overall, I think it's been tested. I think people have looked at it overall. I mean, higher education just absolutely translates into higher costs within our area simply by where we are. I mean, the cost of doing business up here is just expensive versus other parts of the country. So, and I know there's been studies on this before. I think you'll find, though, when you look at the continual increases in aid, I think institutions have tried to keep their, and you can find this information in the National Center of Education Statistics, is institutions within our area have kept fairly low, their increases from year to year. And I think as they just kind of translate it to their cost of doing business. But I don't have a report specifically on that, except to see that overall, I mean, I don't see that it's been out of control. And I think all the other reports that have been done in the past have said that, higher education does a pretty good job of keeping themselves as tight as they can possibly be, based on the cost of doing business in higher ed.
Rip Delnicki.
Thank you, Chairman Doucette. A couple of questions pertaining to some of the information up front. There's the average of 4% per year from 96 to 2012, yet from 2016 to 2019, the average debt levels remained essentially flat. What was the contributing factor to that? Do we know?
We've started to see that student debt is kind of flattening out. I think people are making different decisions. I think as you start seeing people making choices, it all depends on kind of where we are, oftentimes in our history, as to where families will decide on how they want to borrow. Sometimes it's a good good period where some families want to borrow with home equity. Okay, so you'll find that the higher education debt will flatten out. You'll see that people have the 529 plans, are investing well, so they're utilizing those kind of things. So yeah, oftentimes, our student loan debt happens to, oftentimes will correlate with some of the things that are happening in the environment, just in the economy. I think that the increase in Pell Grants in the last several years has made a difference where students are kind of flattening out. I think the approach on all college campuses today, I know on mine, I'm always telling them only borrow what you need. You can only talk so much to a family or to a student for them to make a decision as to what they want to do. But I think the message is only borrow what you need, and borrow smart, be careful. So I think because we take this so seriously, this financial wellness and the financial stability of our students, that I think that you're starting to see that, and people are listening. Families will listen, and oftentimes will make a choice. Sometimes they'll make a choice to go to another institution that will offer a more attractive financial aid package versus investing somewhere else. And I have to say, as a Connecticut person and a Connecticut, longtime Connecticut resident, longtime working at Sacred Heart University, some of my biggest concerns is when our students, we can't offer a same kind of equivalent financial aid package to our student combined with need-based resources, that they'll take themselves to another state. Do you know what I mean? Because we're not able to provide that same thing here. So I think all of these things all together, us considering all these different factors that impact debt, because you're right, there's a lot of different things that cause it to flatten out, are kind of what we're looking at right now. This is a very appropriate time to be looking at that too as well.
So as a follow-up to that question that I posed, the flattening of the increase, is that countrywide, or is it different here because we are in a high cost area?
To me, from what I'm seeing, it seems to be flattening across the country. We're not seeing any huge dips. It's nationwide too as well.
Now, I draw your attention to table 3 and Connecticut ranking number 5 in cost. New Mexico ranking 50.
I'll go back to this presentation again.
New Hampshire was the highest cost on the debt, and California ranking 49th.
Okay, am I on the right chart here? Are we on the right chart? I'm gonna make sure I'm on the right chart.
I'm referring to the table 3 in the actual report.
Oh, not on this report here. You mean the actual report itself?
I think that's the same. Right,
here's the question.
That's the one.
This is the one.
Is this? How is it California is 49th in ranking, and say New Hampshire as a comparator is number 1 in ranking in cost, highest cost, and California lowest cost, which I find that kind of surprising based on the cost of living out in California and all that. So my question there is, what do you attribute that differentiation to, that the two polar extremes?
I think the report tries to focus in on the way in which the states actually appropriate it. And I think if you're looking at the actual report, you'd probably see that it has to do with their various types of financial aid, what they're actually providing to their resources, to the kind of colleges or universities. They tend to actually provide a lot of support to their students in the cost of education. So you might find that they're not going to be borrowing as much. And you also have, even at some of the higher cost institutions, even some of the elite institutions, which you would probably find some in California as well, most of them, you'll find that some of their costs are relatively lower. So there's an interesting part of the report, which I didn't delve into as much as I did for others, that actually speaks to California as kind of a case study. So you might find in that report some of the answers that you're looking for there.
Okay. Another question pertaining to state policy recommendations, page 29 in the actual report, where they make reference, and you made reference to it, on allocating state grant aid based on need and not merit. What changes would have to occur to
Okay.
go to that and shift to that kind of a way of awarding the grants?
All right, so you're, this is the actual report that you're referring to. I think for others, and this is what I'm just going to share with you that I can perhaps provide to others later. This is the one that I actually redlined for. I know people have gotten it in the past, and you're referring to comments on page 29. Is that correct?
Correct.
Information. All right, let's just go to that so others can see what we're talking about. Again, this seems to be a very comprehensive report. Again, it's its 16th annual. They've done a pretty good job here of doing that. So we're getting down to.
And if you want to give it a little more thought, you know, you could report back at the next meeting pertaining to what changes would have to occur to go to that model versus what we currently do.
Okay.
Because they have a number of recommendations there, including, and I'm not sure how this would work out here, is exempting forgiven amounts of federal student loans from state income tax, because that would obviously have some kind of a fiscal impact. And how would that be offset along with
Okay. Yeah, see, this is what you're talking about regarding the methodologies. Is that what is this what you're referring to here? What data are included in the state averages for private debt, or were you referring more to the recommendations made in the report?
Yeah, I'm referring to the recommendations made in the report where they have the state policy recommendations, because I would tend to think at some point we're going to take a look at that and see what makes some kind of sense in the way we do business here in Connecticut.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. These were actually pretty descriptive. I thought these policy recommendations were pretty good. They were outlined pretty well. I did just move this up a little bit. Okay. Here we have institutional. Here is what we have here, the state policy recommendations.
Yeah, especially the one where they talk about requiring colleges within a state to adopt strategies to help reduce the burden of student debt, and how that would play out. And
Yeah.
I realize I'm throwing a lot of questions out there, and I can understand that we may not have the information pertaining to that at this particular point in time, but these are some of the things that we need to be taking a look at and taking into our deliberations on whatever report we come up with at the end of the entire study we're doing here, the entire group, working group work, along with the and could you take a moment and explain a state level longitudinal data system?
Oh, well, you know, I think within all the states, you know, need to look at all the data from all the colleges. It wouldn't be just these reports, but collecting data regarding maybe on the state level institutions, what they're providing. You know, we complete a lot of surveys, so I don't know to what extent, like perhaps the Office of Higher Education is collecting various types of data elements. I mean, in some of our reporting, we are providing specific information regarding the higher education, to complete information on the college costs, the debt, employment outcomes. I mean, we are already providing a fair amount of information to the state. So for us to, perhaps our our state level longitudinal data systems are good enough, are good. I mean, we maybe need to confer with the Office of Higher Education to see exactly what they do have available. What can they get from the National Education Statistics information about other trends and how it compares to other institutions. So I think that we can continue to look at what information we do have, what information exists out there on a national level within the surveys that are completed, our yearly IPEDS reports that colleges and universities submit to the federal government has lots of rich information in it. So I would believe that that's kind of what they're looking at to make that suggestion. And I'm not suggesting that maybe Connecticut doesn't already have a fair amount of that information available.
Well, I certainly appreciate your answers there. And I apologize if some of the questions I asked was questions that were drilling down into the actual thought process of how this was developed and how it would actually work within the state of Connecticut if some of these recommendations were actually adopted. And I appreciate you bringing the report forward. I found it to be very interesting reading. I actually spent the time to read it.
Yeah.
And it's very thorough. So again, thank you for providing the information.
Yeah, and it's very current too. I mean, it's current. It's right up to date. So I think it's of good value for the group.
Rep. Delnicky, no, good questions. And it occurred to me as we were talking that maybe we do need some of that data and from the Office of Higher Ed. So I think it might be a good idea to reach out to them and see if somebody from Office of Higher Ed could join us and answer those specific questions, because I think these are probably good recommendations, but again, not knowing what data is already collected, perhaps that could be within a recommendation of this working group. And then also and Julie, I don't know if you had a slide on this particularly, but the recommendation about state grant aid based on need rather than merit, whether or not we have any information from Connecticut that breaks that down. I assume that's something that the Higher Ed could also provide to us.
Yeah, absolutely. They can provide more. More has shifted to the merit-based aid, need merit, over the last few years, particularly as it converted to the governor's need and then the now called Roberta Willis scholarship program. So yes, I would think the Office of Higher Education would have significant data regarding our current programs from a historical perspective as well.
Yeah, that would be good to see. I mean, again, our charge of this working group is to look at borrowing in particular, but I think this is an important piece of the whole equation. So I think this is definitely something that I think should be within the recommendations of this group to take a closer look at that, even if it's outside sort of the jurisdiction of the banking committee and the issue of borrowing specifically. Let's see here. I think I saw some hands up. Let me go. I have Jeanette Weldon. Jeanette.
Yes, one of the things that Julie touched on that I think is very important is the need for greater financial literacy education. And I think, going back into high school or maybe even middle school, so that students and families can know what is a manageable debt level and at what point is it going to become unmanageable. And then once they're aware of that, then we need to make sure there are options available for funding their education, other than with dollars other than debt. But I think that's something that maybe perhaps could be added to the list of state recommendations, would be enhanced financial literacy education.
Absolutely. Winston.
Great, thank you. Let me see if I can pull my hand down. There we go. Thanks, folks. And thank you, Julie, for really very masterfully presenting on a report that you didn't even write, and then fielding questions also for a report you didn't write. I thought that was great and was a very good explanation of what TICA's put out. One thing I wanted to, and you may have mentioned this, I'm sorry, but it's important to underscore, I think, to take the findings that you did share and even focus on how much more dire they might be for lower income households and for college non-completers, because all of this data was explicitly 4-year bachelor graduates, right? So these are folks who got their degree, and in theory, we live in a society where we hope this is true, right? Are then able to get a job to pay it off. So this doesn't cover, 2-year associate or other degree programs. It doesn't cover non-completers. It doesn't cover folks who, got 1 or 2 years, got the debt, but didn't get the potential earnings power that comes with that. And although we can anticipate that those folks would have lower nominal amounts of debt because they didn't have so many years to get the degree, they probably also have a greater sort of debt to income burden because, again, they're not put in that position to make as much money after having a bachelor's degree. So the TICA's report is great, but I think we should think of it as the tip of the iceberg in terms of what student loan debt can do to a household, because these are in many ways some of the better off graduates in that they have a 4-year degree. So I just wanted to make that point. And then also to build off, Rep, you said the point you made, and many folks have made already today about bringing in someone from the higher ed department to sort of talk about numbers. I think there has historically been a disconnect between education policy and consumer protection policy, and student loans are sort of at the intersection of that. And when thinking through financial aid, that's often done without the input from consumer protection folks. And when thinking through consumer protection solution, it's often done without understanding how schools work, right? How financial aid systems work and what is a viable solution financially and operationally. So I think it would be great to get their involvement the way that we've had the Department of Banking on these calls previously. And that brings me to my last point for now, at least, which is that the TICA's report is great data. It incorporates federal data, which I think it can be pretty reliable and comprehensive. It incorporates survey data, which I think we can think of as reliable, but not necessarily comprehensive. And it even shows in the report of those schools surveyed, what percentage of those schools had viable survey responses. And Connecticut's was pretty high, in terms of an N for a survey, but some states had like 3, right? So, knowing what the data is. So I want to call to this group's attention that because because Connecticut, as with New York and as with many of its neighbors, Massachusetts earlier this year, licenses student loan servicers, uniquely, Connecticut has the ability through that licensure to get a down to the cent snapshot of what the private student loan landscape looks like in the state of Connecticut, as opposed to a survey extrapolation national survey. So it is within the authority of the banking department's licensure to ask its licensed servicers, and they may do this as a safety and soundness examination procedure already, but not reported in such a way that policymakers and the public can access it to understand to an exact figure, 2020, what did that look like? What was the total and the average amount of private student loan debt for residents and borrowers in Connecticut? So I would encourage us, if we dig in with these numbers, to identify the most precise Connecticut specific sources as possible.
That's a great point, Winston. I know Matt Smith is with us. I don't know if he's prepared to sort of comment on that or offer any thoughts, but as to your first point about trying to capture data from some of those maybe non-traditional programs or uncompleted degree programs, where might we be able to look to get more information on that, you think? Any thoughts?
I think, yeah, and this is, again, we start to see the chasm between education policy and consumer protection policy a little bit. So, you can find out about non-completion from institutions themselves, right? Who didn't re-enroll, who transferred. I think it would be very hard, I'm sort of thinking on the fly, but I think it would be very hard to tell the story of student debt through non-completion short of survey data, short of like trying to get to those borrowers, to those former students. I think that the data that exists out there are sort of one or the other, and it's hard to then pair it and understand how person A, B, or C handled their debt from their partial education over the years that followed. There are some great reports soon to come out, and I'll share with this group once they're public, that do a little bit of that work actually, but it's through longitudinal surveys plus snapshot sort of user experience style. How are you doing surveys? So it's a thorny issue, and I think we can be creative about it, but I don't think that there is a department somewhere that is sitting on a great data set that can tell that story completely.
Okay, but I think the point's well taken. It's undeniable. I think that there probably is some borrowing that may not be captured because it's, again, sort of the non-traditional, colleges.
Yeah, and actually to Representative Donahue's point, and to riff off one of the recommendations in the report about putting in accountability metrics into state-based financial aid programs for schools, I think there's an accountability metric there that is mirrored at the federal level that is about graduation rates. And we talked a little bit last time about cohort default rates and making sure schools that are receiving public dollars are actually doing the work of educating people in a meaningful way and having 3 to 5 year look back periods, basically, to understand how that works. There are other ways. There are sort of complementary ways that states can restrict the receipt of state dollars for schools. And one example that at least New York has done and others have explored is conditioning the receipt of those dollars on not requiring students to enter binding arbitration agreements and other practices that are considered anti-consumer, anti-student. And not only is that good policy in many folks' opinion, it also ensures that any school-centric problems, abuses, fiscal, otherwise, are able to see the light of day because they go to court, as opposed to being in a behind closed door arbitrary setting. So it's just another way to make sure that limited state dollars, because we can all agree they're limited, are going to institutions that are going to use them appropriately and not also engage in consumer abuses. And if a certain set of schools that receive these dollars end up having poor outcomes, the state should divert funds from that school to other schools that have better and certainly less abusive outcomes. So there's creative conditioning that you can use state dollars to get good, safe student and borrower outcomes at schools.
Interesting. Okay. Anyone else on this round before we switch gears a little bit to talk about the New York program and income-driven repayment? If
Yeah,
not,
sorry, if I can jump in. I don't have a raise hand feature on my Zoom. I don't know what's happening. But the only thing I wanted to add, I want to echo what Winston said for sure. But I wanted to add that sometimes we look at default rates as indicators of like successes of like ability to pay back, right? And sometimes we're not taking into account that what ends up happening is that people are actually making decisions not to eat, not to be able to provide for their basic needs because they have to be able to pay off their student debt. So often we rely on default rates to measure success and the ability to pay back, without often understanding what the relationship is between the default, that people aren't paying them back, but really what are some other needs that are not being met for their ability to pay back, right? So I think that's also important because as long as the student does the right thing by paying back their debt, it seems as everything is okay, without really contextualizing what other things might be happening, what they might be giving up in order to be able to make those payments for the purposes of not getting their wage garnered, whatever the consequences might be for those particularly defaulting, right? And then the only thing I wanted to add was that we talked a little bit about the increase of grant aid from institutions. And so it would be, and I think somebody else mentioned it already, but I wanted to echo that it would be really important to think about the intersections of has higher education enrollment decreased? And is that part of the reason why the debt seems to have leveled off? Right, and is the increase of the grant aid of institutions, right? What is the relationship between the increased grant aid from the institutions themselves and also the amount of money that the higher education is costing now, right? So the amount of the ticket of being able to afford that education versus the grant aid that they're being given, right? And in relationship with how many, is there an increase in enrollment, a decrease in enrollment? Because that also matters in terms of choice. There are a lot of folks who are just choosing not to go to college, right? Because of this, right? And so that will impact schools ultimately, right? That might not be a thing that impacts them right now, but as the numbers continue to decrease, right, because of the amount of money it takes. So that might be another way to be able to look at those intersections.
No, Krista, that's a good question. And I don't know if Julie has any thoughts on that. What does enrollment look like? And the report touched on it a little bit, the impact of COVID-19 and what that might have done to enrollment and borrowing. But what does enrollment look like over the last couple of years on a sort of macro level, or if you know within Connecticut or just within your institutions that Sacred Heart's a member of?
We've seen concern across the country. And I think that's obviously a little bit pre-COVID as well. And there's certainly been some issues and concerns within various types of communities of students and various communities regarding the concern for the enrollment. And I think when we've seen the FAFSA, the decline in completion of the FAFSA, and I know here in the state of Connecticut, we've been very concerned about that. And there's been an effort to try to get that FAFSA completion, that there is a concern here within the state that perhaps maybe our enrollment is not as strong as it could be. And I think it all depends on the institutions. You have some institutions that are way up and you have some institutions that are down. So it's hard to say, but I think across the country, there's been a concern.
Yeah. And I think our state institutions have been struggling as well. And the community colleges, I know perhaps surprisingly last I heard, and I don't have the current data in front of me, where enrollment was lagging a little bit. That may be another thing that if we could get the Office of Higher Ed to join us or provide us with some information that they could do, because that would be helpful to know as well. Okay, so with that, going to shift gears a little bit. I'm going to ask Zani Imatevsky from our policy team here at the legislature to give us an overview of a program we found in New York, a new program that may also be relevant and something that we could entertain here in Connecticut as a potential solution. So Zani.
Hello, everyone. I can share the screen. Yes. Sorry about the delay. And so I will tell you, my presentation is nowhere as exciting as Julie's, but it is what it is. It has some colors. And I will tell you what I'm going to present today is a concept. I want to introduce a concept to all of you and kind of think about it, and you can change the details as we go. So this is the New York State kind of get on your feet program. Colorado is also kind of thinking about the same program, and they may have adopted it. I'm just trying to still figure out that part of this presentation. So what it is, the New York State program is a program that provides up to 24 months of federal student loan debt relief to college graduates who are participating in federal income-driven repayment plan. If you're eligible, you make less than $50,000 a year, and you also live in the state. You must also have graduated after December of 2014 from a college or university in New York State, enrolled in an income-based repayment plan with the federal government. And the plans are typically only an option for those with a good amount of debt and have lower earnings. So this is basically a lot of the eligibility stuff that we pulled from the website. A few that I'd like to highlight is the legal resident, like in New York State, you have to be. One of the things that now I'm thinking about a little bit carefully that I want to get clarification on is the fact that you have to be at least graduated from high school or receive a high school diploma or an undergraduate degree. This income-based repayment plan is one that helps us highlight the people who may be most in need. And then one of the factors that I think may be helpful to Connecticut is the part where you have to have primary work location in New York State and employed in New York State, which would probably carry over to Connecticut. So again, the award amounts would be that 24 months of payment equal to the amount of the repayment plan. And the payments are made directly to the borrower's federal student loan servicers. And the people who run the program is the New York State Higher Education Services Corporation. And so the next slide, I'll show you a little bit more of their award amounts and the amount of students they've kind of awarded. These are a lot lower than their original estimates, but over the last year, it's been around the highest, around 2.5 million, and around 2,000 students they've kind of given out awards to. What I think, and what I guess the policy department thinks, I guess it'll incentivize graduates with lower starting salaries who are entering the workforce to stay in the state and kind of gain that experience they may need, and especially if they have higher debt, and allows them to focus on starting their careers in their field and gaining professional experience. I think also this would be one part of a larger strategy and also recommendation, so it's something to consider. And depending on how you would structure this recommendation and what items of it you would change, it would change the cost. It would also change who would be eligible for it. So with that, I guess, much quicker. So is there any concerns, questions?
No, that's good. Thank you, Zani. And I think it's a great way to just sort of kick off the discussion on other potential solutions, unique state solutions. My first question, and I think it will maybe help us as we dive into this a little more, is for maybe Jeanette can help us out with this, or Julie, to explain the federal income-driven repayment program and how that might dovetail with a state program like this. Is there, Jeanette,
Yeah, I would actually defer to Julie if she's aware. There are a lot of intricacies to the program, and I think it's a little bit tricky to follow and know whether or not you qualify and how to qualify, et cetera. But Julie, do you have anything to share?
You're right. It is tricky on who qualifies and how long, it's based. But, I might actually defer to Josh. I bet, Josh, do you have a little bit more information on that? I mean, there's so many different payment plans, but the income contingent, from what I understand, depends on the amount of money that a student a borrower makes, that will be related to the percentage of their salary. And they have over a number of years. Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, is it not 25 years to repay? And after that, it's forgiven?
There's various different income-based repayment models.
So many different ones.
I think Winston's saying he's happy to jump in here, but yeah, there's various ones across the federal platform.
Yeah, there's so many.
Yeah, no, I think you've more or less summarized it, but I think the important takeaways for folks who are not familiar is there are 3 or 4 programs that are all referred to as income-driven plans. Various federal student loans qualify for some or all or none of them, and so it gets confusing there. They base your monthly your monthly payment on usually 10 to 15% of what's called your adjusted gross income, and that they use a formula above the federal poverty line as sort of your take-home adjusted gross income there, and then you're responsible for that 10 to 15% of your take-home monthly payment. As Julie was just referencing, it varies between the plans. After 20 to 25 years of making these payments, you can have the remainder of your federal student loans forgiven. Income-driven repayment is also a crucial part of the public service loan forgiveness program. You have to be on an income-driven repayment plan to qualify for that, and that forgiveness is after 10 years. Some pitfalls, though, about the income-driven repayment plan, and just last week, the Department of Education in DC finished about 3 months of rulemaking, a process in the rulemaking about income-driven repayment plans specifically. Some pitfalls are when you calculate the 10 to 15%, the payment you end up having to make very often doesn't even cover the interest portion of what your monthly regular payment would be. And although the department doesn't hold you responsible for that, you're listed as current, the interest grows and grows and grows every month. And it can do something called capitalizing, where it's folded into the principal, and you have what's called negative amortization, where you suddenly have more to pay back than you borrowed, right? And when the lifetime of this program is 20 to 25 years, you have people who suddenly took out $50,000 but owe $190,000 and have been making payments every month for the entire time they've been on it. And the final, with the hope of forgiveness, but really a hope of affordability, right? It's more an affordability plan than a forgiveness plan. And the final thing I'll say about it as a potential pitfall is it requires annual recertification. On the one hand, that makes sense because you're pegging it to your income, so you need to know what your income is. On the other hand, we know servicers have a mixed track record here, and it's incredibly onerous for people, or it is proven onerous for people to do this on time. And there are some pretty dire ramifications for not recertifying on a timely basis. You can fall out of that 20 years. You can have your interest capitalized and suddenly balloon your total amount and have a standard, divided by 10 years monthly payment due. Some recent reporting showed that of the I might be overstating here, but of the 40,000+ or maybe even 400,000 people on income-driven repayment plans, only like a handful over the 20 years it's been in existence have gotten forgiveness, and that's a reflection of how difficult it is to navigate. So more on that, because the Biden administration is proposing yet another income-driven repayment plan to add to the sort of alphabet soup of options that the current proposal would, relevant for this group, I think, limit it to only loans taken out for undergraduate education. So it's a total labyrinth, and it is unfortunately not as affordable as I think folks hoped it would be, and as it might sound on paper.
Yeah, I think Winston makes a good point there about, allowing borrowers to pay a minimum payment that's actually less than the actual payment on the loan. And it goes back to Jeanette's point about financial literacy. Those that don't know are like, okay, I can pay a smaller amount. I'll be reported as current on my loans, and it all seems good. When in reality, the interest is still, they're paying less than the accruing interest, and the balances continue to rise.
Yeah, and that's actually very psychologically demoralizing for someone who's making payments on a low budget and then seeing their balance go up and up and up. And it's sort of is like, why am I even doing this? I'm trying. And then for literally 18 years, you can be doing that and something can happen and suddenly boop, the whole thing capitalizes and you have a gigantic outstanding balance.
Yeah, that's been problematic. As we understand it to be, they're always paying interest first and they never get to pay into the principal. And as we know that's, that in itself is that, that mental anguish regarding what Winston just said for the students. So it's hard. Sometimes students don't even want to be part of those programs because of the knowledge of what will be coming down the pike. But there's also the executive order that was supposedly signed into consideration yesterday that I think is putting the federal government on the hot seat with the, we have to get back into COVID, we have to clean up the COVID thing. We've only got 48 days before that's all going to be, students are going to get back into repayment. What does that mean for students with default, with, how they're going to be able to make their repayments? The government has all different servicers regarding their loans. So we have some concerns, I think, as a country that we've got, we've got to be paying attention to right now in these next 48 to 50 days.
If I can add as well, I think that it is both true that it is a labyrinth, right? But I think I want to emphasize Winston's key phrase of affordability. Sometimes the program itself is the only way that folks can afford their debt, right? So you go from, I can give you a personal example from a member of our collective, right? That you can do $500, right? That would be your typical monthly payment, $500, $600 for an entry-level position. Somebody who's in an entry-level position, maybe making $35,000 a year, $32,000 a year. That could be, right, depending on how everything is set up. And versus if going into a income-driven solution program, you might end up really, really low, right? You might be in the 200s and the 150s and the 300s. So that changes the calculations in your ability to afford even your monthly payments. So although it is an alphabet soup with the current structure that exists, it is one that folks have been able to use, some people with the understanding that they might never be able to pay that back. But that they also know that their wages might not be taken or seized, that there's some other things that people put into consideration as we're thinking about affordability and paying back, in terms of instituting a program like this here as well.
Good, thank you. Thank you. No, this is good discussion. Winston, I had a question for you, I guess, just to bring it back and dumb it down for me. Sorry. An income-driven based repayment program, you said there's about 3 or 4 of them. In order to qualify or in order to enroll, somebody would just have to basically sign up with their servicer and check their eligibility. And and then they would be allowed to essentially defer a portion of their payments. Is that right?
In effect, it's not so much a deferment because they're not necessarily expected to be responsible for it at any point in time. But yes, you apply, there's an application, you run it through your servicer. You can have your account be put into a forbearance pending the approval if paying in the near term is a problem for you. Currently, and this is frankly good for anyone tuning in, I don't know what the viewership of this is, but the servicers are allowing, in light of the repayment resuming in February, they're allowing by phone attestation-based applications. So if it's going to be a rigmarole for you to get paperwork about your income and submit it, you can just call your servicer today and say, I'm asking for income-driven repayment. I make $47,000, and they'll put it into effect for you. That's not the normal case. So it is normally very paperwork heavy, but it runs exactly as you described through your servicer. They say you normally owe $100. Now you owe us $15, but that $85 remaining isn't going away. It's just going to sit on your account. And then next month, again, $15, but that $85 remaining gets added to the first $85 remaining, and that's how it builds up and up and up.
Got you. Yep. And then again, a separate but related issue is the forgiveness piece of it, which we understand has been difficult, and there have been some problems with that on the federal level. So I think we understand that. But I wanted to send it back over to Zani for a comment or question.
So I sometimes even on Zoom, I think I get a little bit lost because we're all in different places, but I just want to make sure that I presented this clearly, because there is the federal already, and I don't know if income driven plan, we can't do too much about it, but I want to make sure that this program helps us provide funds for those people who are on the plan and are able to pay for that. And I think that is where the line that we're trying to do here is provide a certain amount of funds available to these students who are already on the plan in the state of Connecticut to get, I guess, on their feet while in the state. And as Julie had presented in her presentation, we are in the higher debt portion in Connecticut. So this kind of threads that line for the state of Connecticut in providing them that option. So it's just an idea, it's a concept, it's a beginning, but it's where I wanted to go with it. So thank you. And again, any questions you can kind of shoot it at.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why when I saw this, thought it was useful because it provides the criteria, it provides a gateway, if you will, to the state to provide that additional assistance without having to reinvent the wheel. So again, those borrowers presumably have already been sort of vetted by their servicers according to the federal guidelines, and then the state of New York is then stepping in and providing that additional assistance. So that's why I thought it made sense to look at this.
Though just on that point, I think it's exactly right. Zani, thanks for clarifying that. Though I would say as Connecticut, as we move forward, we should be very, not hesitant, but intentional about deciding to use a system as the gateway to a state-based system when we know that federal system has flaws, right? Because if to get through the income-driven repayment gauntlet is leaving some folks out, we're only going to get the folks who made it through. So just as a word of caution for that, I think it might be the way to do it just for a number of reasons, but we should intentionally make that decision if that's a route that Connecticut explores.
And Winston, that's where you come in, because you're going to fix that over the next few years, right?
Well, we should all circle back next summer when the department is taking comments on their next proposal and we can submit something together.
Okay, good. Rep. Delnicki.
Thank you, Chairman Doucette. Couple of comments here. The obvious question is, does it buy somebody some relief? for that 24-month period. When they're looking at a situation where they're trying to get into a decent job, they've got their degree, they're going through a lot of stress at a point in time in their life. Does it provide some kind of relief? Yep. Yeah, that's a question.
I usually defer. No. So I think if you're in that situation, I think there's an option for that. I think that's the idea of the program. I think that's what it is. I think that's the idea of the program. I'm not in that situation. It's hard for me to say, but I think that is the idea of the program.
Do we know, because you had a very one pager that it was like $1 million one year, it was 2.5 million another year. I think it was 2 million a different year. Do we know how many folks are actually getting helped at those dollar figures to see if it makes some kind of sense, if there's a barometer there as to how much, or how, based on the amount of money available, how many folks would end up getting helped?
So that's a good question. And I think we plan to reach out, and we've been reaching out to New York. And that's a question I think we'll follow up on and get a little bit more solid numbers and how they administer the program. I think that's a solid question, though.
Another follow-up. So the state of New York is providing the money. That's a question. Is the state of New York providing the money?
Again, that's a question that we're waiting for New York to get back to us on. So that is where or how they fund it. We know. So I got from their financials how they spend the money. I'm just looking to how they fund it, and that is a good question.
The application itself, just to be clear here, the application is filled out by the borrower and they send the application to the state of New York, or do they send it to the loan servicer, or both? Because if New York's actually providing the money, then obviously they would want to see the application to validate it. And then, of course, the loan servicer would then need some kind of notification that, yes, we've got this program here, and yes, the individual's qualified for it, and yes, you should be offering it to them because they've made the hurdle with the application process. Is that how it works?
Yes. So the application goes through the state of New York. It's serviced by the New York State Higher Education Service Corporation, and also the New York State will pay the loan servicer directly as well. So the payment doesn't go to the applicant; it will go directly to the loan servicer. So they're gonna need the information from the applicant. If that makes sense.
Do we know what kind of disclosure the state of New York would, or the loan servicer would be providing the applicant when it comes to, yes, you're deferring payments, but you're accruing extra interest? Is there that kind of a declaration? And again, I don't expect you to have the answer, but I think it's follow-up information we need to know, because I would think that truth in lending, there would have to be some kind of a declaration there so that a person walked into it, if they were going to utilize the program, with their eyes open, knowing that, yeah, there's more interest that could conceivably accumulate based on the loan, based on the deferment. And would that deferment in any way be considered income for New York State income tax?
So we can ask for how they run their application system and those details, and we'll be happy to share with the committee. The tax part of it is something we'll have to ask as well. So those are questions. As I said at the beginning, it's a concept, it's an idea, a starting point, and then from there we can definitely flesh out any ideas, and especially during how far the committee task force wants to take it during the legislative process. I think that's where a lot of the tax questions and those get really fleshed out. But at this point, again, it's a concept.
Because I have to admit, I was curious enough to actually go online and find the program and actually take a look at it. And depending on how they fund it, depending on how they administer it, if there's proper disclosure, then it conceivably could end up helping somebody. That's my observation. So I look forward to getting the complete information to these questions as to whether or not it's something we might want to consider. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Fred, good.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So, yeah, just kind of a couple, kind of questions and comments for the whole group here. And, I think as Winston pointed out and a few others, right, I think, look to caution on, designing any type of program, similar to what the federal government has, as so many borrowers have had issues in navigating through that process and seeing their balances increase with only the hope of forgiveness, right? Which largely has not been any type of reality for those customers, right? As a regulated bank, whenever we're looking at making any decisions around how we, work with our customers and what type of programs, we're able to offer them, right? Then, it's in, our interest and our customers' interest in making sure that, these decisions and offerings that are going to be made have the right fit, right? That the product fits for the use and for the consumer. And that's, something with a 20 to 25 to 30 year, length on this debt, right? That you need to look at in terms of both the short term and the long term. Right. So I guess, I'm really just trying to highlight and consider, while, many borrowers may be seeing, a better path here in the short term, if all we're actually doing is kicking the can down the road for that customer and they end up with debt that they can't handle, whether it's 2 years or 10 years down the line, then how we actually serve that customer and that resident of Connecticut if something's been changed.
Okay, good point. There's concern to go with this, I'm hearing, so something to be noted. But again, I think to Rep. Delnicki's point, I think also wearing the state lawmaker hat, there may be ways also to either work around that or to make sure that, that we're backstopping, right? Any potential, existing liability or something that, if something goes awry, or again, that, the federal government continues to struggle with the terms of the forgiveness that the state, if we do have a program that's similar, that we could also support it or backstop it. So good points.
And one thing also that might be helpful if we can get this data is how many Connecticut students are already in this status, just so we have a sense of what is the universe that this program as structured would apply to.
Thank you, Jeanette, because I was going to add that I think that like the approach, I like Zeddy how you said that it was the beginning, right? Because I think the approach of looking at how many already are in this status in Connecticut, right? Rather than reinventing the wheel or doing our own process of recertification ourselves, there's a ton of paperwork that goes through the states to the federal government, to the federal agencies that can just be given to the state, right? And so like how many people are already in that income repayment status in the state of Connecticut? Because I think that will highlight the fact, to your point, Rep. Tom Delnicki, is that it could help some folks, right? So it it is the awareness that interest will accumulate. It is the awareness that like that might not be best for some folks, but some folks are already in that income repayment solution. Many folks already are, and some of them might be struggling with those initial payments to get on their feet. So although it's not necessarily, I think it's a piece, Sandy, like you said, of the holistic approach, but being able to take that holistic approach to know how many people are already in that categorization and how many people can benefit from that, because people are going to have to enter those categorizations whether we offer that program or not, based on the national, just the national infrastructure that exists.
That's good. Thank you. All right. Anyone else on this topic? So I think this has been a great discussion thus far. I guess I'll open it up for anything else that maybe we haven't covered today. Anything that anyone else wanted to add at this time. I think this has been a great discussion, and obviously, you know, in talking about the income-based repayment, it's not it's one potential solution, not the only potential solution. And, you know, dovetailing back to the report that we discussed earlier, I think that there are some great recommendations within that report for state policy that we should look at. I think we also discussed that we do need some more information. So we are going to reach out to the Office of Higher Education to try to see if we could get that information, or perhaps they can even join us for one of our sessions. And that is on the amount of grants, need-based versus merit-based. We talked about enrollment and whether or not that may have any relationship to the data we're looking at. And then also the data on the federal income-based repayment program, what that enrollment looks like in Connecticut right now. If there's anything else that I missed that we might be looking for, let me know. But that's, I think that's good information. So I think, you know, from here, we do have a meeting scheduled on January 11th, which, as I mentioned earlier, we had thought about perhaps being our last meeting and having a report. I would think it might be, based on the discussion today, a good idea to like I said, invite the Office of Higher Ed to attend that meeting or provide some information for us to discuss at that meeting. And then number two, maybe have a draft report that we could look at. And then I would say maybe leave it open if there are other things that we want to include in that report, or changes we want to make to perhaps even convene another session, maybe later in January as well, or something like that. But again, I think if we could get maybe a draft report, it would start to formulate and summarize some of the things that we've been talking about, and then we can see if there's any other, you know, discussion from there. Does that sound like a plan? Anyone else? Jeanette, any other thoughts or parting comments today?
No, I think this was a great meeting. And I think we're, you know, heading in the right direction in terms of identifying the key issues and what some potential solutions might be.
Agreed. Rep. Delnicki.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Doucette. And the student debt and the class of 2020 report, though very lengthy, has a lot of good information in there. And I think there's a lot that we could glean from it when it comes to the recommendations. Some might work for us, some might not. But at least it would be a good discussion as to whether or not a particular item in there would be something we would want to include. So I think you could put that into the draft, and then we can have a discussion on that. So just a suggestion, Chair.
Yep, that is a good suggestion. And, you know, for everyone, any other information that you want to contribute, any other thoughts or ideas in the meantime before our next session, feel free to email the chairs or to Dawn or really to everyone if there's other thoughts or information, and we can have this sort of be an evolving project.
Rep Doucette, one other thing to add to that list of potentially talking about next time, if that's okay, is more and more states are, I think, seeing their actual budget surpluses shake out. And it'd be interesting to know what Connecticut is looking at. I saw some reporting from a couple of weeks ago that it could be as much as $900 million, which is a lot of money, a lot of money after a couple of years where states didn't have a lot of money. And I know that some states are thinking about, is this the time we wrap our arms around our state level student debt problem, whether it's a one-shot deal kind of, let's wipe some stuff clean, we don't have to solve every problem to solve one problem, or if it's a sort of more longitudinal approach. It'd be interesting to get a sense of what dollars are out there and what the appetite is for lawmakers in Connecticut to take an approach like that.
No, I think that's a good point. We do indeed, that number you saw, I think is reality, at least in terms of how it has been portrayed to us from our nonpartisan Office of Fiscal Analysis. So there are certainly many options, and I would defer to my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee as to how we're going to deal with that. But I think higher education is always an important part of the picture for us here. So it's a point well taken, and I think we'll certainly play into some of the discussions we'll be having on a budget level in the coming months. So okay. Well, with that, I want to thank everyone once again for your participation. This was a great meeting. I wish everyone a happy and joyous holiday season and a happy new year. And I look forward to seeing everyone again in January. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Happy holidays.
Thank you.